What would happen if every Catholic bishop in your country denied the Pope, the Catholic faith, and the Catholic Church? Except for maybe one. This actually did happen in the 1500s. We're talking about the Kingdom of England under Henry VIII. All the bishops, except for one, St. John Fisher, went along with the apostasy with Henry VIII. So today, I'm joined with Ryan Grant. He's puffing away on his pipe. I didn't have the heads up or I would have got mine out. So he's going to
sorry about that.
Share his wisdom and his smoke. And we're going to talk about what happened in the 1500s. Is there any parallel to what's going on today with bishops, apostasy, denial, etc.? So before we pray, Ryan Grant, how are you?
I'm well, and yourself?
Doing great. It's got a nice backdrop you got there. Green trees, blue sky, smoke. Kind of jealous.
Smoke. Just a little bit cold, but we're doing okay.
Good. All right, we're going to pray our Father, the Pater Noster. You want to pray the second half with us, Ryan?
Certainly.
Okay. Here we go. Oremus. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Pater Noster, qui es in caeli, sanctificetur nomen tuum, adveniat regnum tuum, fiat voluntas tua, sicut in cielo et in terra.
Panem nostrum quotidianum da nobis hodie, dimitte nobis debita nostra, sicut nos dimittimus debitoribus nostris, et ne nos inducas in tentationem, sed libera nos a malo. Amen.
Amen. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. All right, before we jump into this great topic, everybody please like the video, hit the thumbs up, please subscribe and turn notifications on. And most importantly, I've been forgetting to ask y'all to do this. Please share this video on Twitter and Facebook. Really helps get this video out when you guys do the sharing. Okay, Ryan Grant. In the 1500s, everybody knows who Henry VIII was. He was that fat king who killed a bunch of his wives, and he wanted a divorce, and Archbishop Cranmer granted him an annulment, and he broke with Rome. But they don't know that essentially most the bishops, save one, also went along with this plan. It's a pretty big scandal for Catholics. Can you kind of give us, before we focus on that, sort of the lead up to who Henry VIII was and this kind of strange way that he got the crown? And I guess that kind of also relates to the death of his brother and Catherine of Aragon and kind of the sketchy marital setup that happened there.
Certainly. Well, in the first place, in the 15th century, the late 15th century, the English church was a little better off than some churches in the continent. Certainly had better music. It was a little less corrupt, but at the same time, it was still perfectly accommodating to the royal will when it needed to be. And so you had a country divided by by succession, and the King Henry VI. He had come back, from France. Didn't really care about the French possessions that English nobility and royalty had bled and died for, and spent treasure on. So here, he's actually a fairly pious king, builds churches, prays the Rosary, lots of good things in that realm. But a lot of the nobles are like, well, he's wasting our patrimony. We can't have this. And so they say, Bolingbroke and his father Henry V, that whole line. They didn't actually have as good of a claim to the throne as the Duke of York, Edward. So maybe he should be king. And thus the country splits into factions, and there's nothing else to do but fight for it. So Henry, during that time, he goes in and out of fits of insanity. Eventually he loses. But before he does that, he marries somebody in his family to a young princess, Margaret Beaufort. So she's married to Owen Tudor. Owen Tudor's, connected to the throne, but somewhat tangentially, and this will kind of come back a little bit later, in terms of the wars, that follow under Henry VII. But Margaret Beaufort wants to protect her son at all costs during the Wars of the Roses. She largely stays out of it, although she's part of the Lancastrian side, not the Yorkist side. The Yorkists win. So Margaret has her possessions stripped, and her son, Henry, goes to exile in France. He eventually comes back with an army after Edward dies and Richard III. He ticks everybody off as the story goes. I mean, just to not belabor the point too much. Henry comes in largely with a French army. He wins at Bosworth and then, becomes king. So here he is. And the War of the Roses hadn't quite died out yet. There's still people saying, the York side has the right of hereditary succession, and Henry VII, it's so weak. It's such a tangential claim. Why is he even there? So during so during Henry's time, there is Henry VII. That is, there's constant uprisings. There's even one day a guy who used to model clothing over in Wales, Perkin Warbeck. Well, he gets picked up by the Yorkists, and they say, he bears a resemblance to one of the princes in the Tower, right? Which is a story I passed over for time's sake. And they prop him up as the young Edward V, when really he is not, right? And so they know he's a pretender. But anyway, he gets propped up as this figurehead king. So in the Duke of York and whatnot. So Henry takes his heir to the throne, because Henry is gifted with an heir and a spare, as they say. He's got two sons. He's got Arthur, and then he's got his own, Henry, the younger, future Henry VIII. So he takes the young Henry, and now he makes him a knight, and formally installs him as Duke of York. So you have a counterfeit Duke of York. You got to set up a good one, and that's more or less how they're raised. And a lot of people don't realize that Henry VIII, his upbringing is largely with the women of the household. It's with his mother. It's with his sisters. There's, all the medieval courtly romance. Those are the stories that he's more or less nursed on. So the Perkin Warbeck rebellion dies out. Now Henry's Duke of York and a knight, right? And so he starts getting his training in Latin. He gets his training in the things that princes should know in history. And then his brother dies. His brother Arthur is married to the Princess of Aragon, Catherine, the youngest daughter of Isabella and Ferdinand. And
can I just say something? Can I just say something?
Yeah.
How cool! Because Henry's brother was Arthur. He was supposed to be the king.
Right.
That would have been so cool to have a King Arthur again.
I know, right?
Man, that would be.
And,
I guess would they have named him King Arthur II?
That's a good question. I don't know. It depends. I mean, the very name Arthur was part of Henry VII's kind of quest for legitimacy.
Yeah.
Thomas More names him the Winter King. He's very disliked, although he has his supporters these days, but he's very much disliked, and with good reason. He was very tyrannical in his rule, and he had to be, because he's got this whole faction of the nobility that wants him out.
You talking about H7?
King Henry VII, yeah.
Okay.
So Henry VII, he'll come back to this story when we get to our saint today. So Henry VII, really, what he needs to do is legitimacy. So he even sets up the round table, as it were. It's fabricated, but it's supposed to be based on the original. And when visitors come, they're told, of course, it's the original, when it's not. And things of this sort. Henry VIII.
Oh, for real? He actually had a round table.
Hey, look at the round table. Henry VII had a round table.
Kind of like that. It's cool.
And it was part of the legitimacy. We're going to bring on all this King Arthur stuff. We're going to make it real. And see, I even have a real Arthur.
Did he have a dude walking around like Merlin?
Yeah.
That'd be cool, too.
Yeah. It would be cool.
I like Merlin. If y'all want to, I actually do a Christianized version of who Merlin was in my book, my novel, Sword and Serpent. He's like a proto Merlin. Check it out. Anyway.
I like it better than Mallory's edition. But anyway, that version. So Henry then, so this is part of what a lot of people don't know. So Arthur dies, and there's a question. And the papal bulls that come down in this, actually, it shows they were already aware of this particular question all the way back in 1498. Right? So was Catherine a virgin? Was she carnally known by her husband, Arthur, before he died? And it's one of those cases where the annulment case that later comes down under Henry VIII, popes historically had granted such annulments, by the way, even on more specious grounds than anything involved in Henry's case. Louis XII, for example. Alexander VI gave annulment to, he got his own family members annulled when he needed to, right? And so it's
not unlike it's not unlike Catholic politicians nowadays that just get annulments easy.
well, not even just politicians, almost anybody.
That's true.
And it's like that, except in those days you could only get it if you were royal, because those were the only ones who could afford it. But now, today, it's more or less kind of across the board. Everyone gets it. Oh yeah, I just he looked at me wrong when we the first week, and so I don't know. I mean, there are legitimate grounds for annulments, obviously, and I don't want to get sidetracked on that issue too much. We know there's a lot of fraud and abuse in the system. There's many kind of lawyers and people who worked on tribunals and say, yeah, they just kind of want to move it along without, defender of the bond. He's like just writing paperwork these days. So, I mean, we go on about that forever. So anyway, in this case, so Catherine, was she carnally known by Arthur? And would this have, because he mixes in with the aspects of canon law, what's in Scripture, how binding the Scripture is on these points. Is that Old Testament ceremonial law, or is this divine law? Right, and so I guess we can hash those out a little bit later. So at this time, what Pope Julius II does is he gives a bull of to the English, which is going to allow Henry to marry Catherine, right, which dispenses from consanguinity, because in those days, being related to the in-law. Right, that's also considered consanguinity, even though you're not physically by blood related. You are now by marriage and by right, by legal right. So that dispensation. But when he gave the dispensation to Catherine, Catherine insisted that there be an explicit mention of the fact that, or not Catherine, it would say Isabella. Isabella insisted that there be an explicit mention of the virginity of Catherine, and which the Roman canonists then write in the bull and send to Isabella. So you have two different bulls, and this will come back into play later under Henry VIII. So, ultimately, who knows the absolute truth of that matter? Well, God and Catherine of Aragon.
Right.
And,
so let me kind of
probably Henry.
Let me break that down for people. So Henry VIII's older brother was Arthur. He was supposed to be king. He was married to Catherine of Aragon, but he died when he was young. And Catherine of but
6 months after the marriage.
What's that?
6 months after the marriage.
6 months after the marriage. But they need the Spanish princess to marry the English prince for political ties. Catherine of Aragon, who was married to Arthur, the older brother, says, yeah, we were married 6 months, but we never had sex. I'm still a virgin. I can now marry Arthur's little brother, Henry VIII.
Mm-hmm.
That's what happened. And she says, I'm still a virgin. Arthur and I never got it on. Why would that be? Wasn't it because Arthur was hunting or traveling or something?
There was an outbreak. No, well, it's theoretically possible. There was an outbreak of plague.
Corona.
Arthur died, which they it's tuberculosis. And so it's theoretically possible that he was already getting symptoms of it and held off. Like I said, theoretically possible.
Right.
Is it plausible? I don't know. I've gone back and forth on this, and a lot of people have over the years. And ultimately, again, Catherine and the only one that really knows that, and God, obviously. Obviously Arthur, they're all in heaven. Hopefully, some of them. But we don't know for an absolute fact. I don't think there's any way to solve that case any more than the papal legatine court could have in 1531.
Right.
So it's so it's one of those open questions. It's possible. Is it plausible? It sort of beggars the imagination. The young 16-year-old boy with a Spanish princess and decides to wait. Maybe he was good and virtuous and wasn't interested that way, and he was chaste, maybe a little more so than he needed to be. Who knows? I don't know. And there's no contemporary evidence that I know of. So it's again, it's an open question, I think. So, but beside that, so then so the Spanish dynastic union was important for England because their main adversary is the French. And so Ferdinand, then after Isabella dies, Ferdinand is King of Aragon and more or less de facto King of Spain. And that's only because Cardinal Jimenez, who's another great church reformer, he holds the whole country together for Ferdinand. And in exchange, Ferdinand gets him a cardinal's hat, which he didn't want. And Jimenez didn't want. But anyway, so Spain is the preeminent power. Now you have the discovery of the Americas. And so this is the place that you have to work with, right, Spain. So England, this is an alliance that seems to work well for Henry VII. Although as time goes on, he sours. And the reason is because Ferdinand was a less than reliable ally. Ferdinand did not pay the dowry for Catherine. And so Catherine's living in England. She doesn't speak the language. She has no, her household is basically volunteering and begging for money. They actually don't have any money. And, she's in this precarious position. Henry's kind of head over heels in love with her, and has been since he gave her away at the wedding of his older brother before he died. So Henry is just like, wow, this is great. He's in love. And his father makes him repudiate it to try to play hardball with Ferdinand to get him to actually pay up some of his obligations. And this will be a continual problem actually throughout the next 15 years or so. It's Ferdinand not ponying up his end of his obligations. But he gets to this point, St. Henry VII is like, let's just repudiate the whole thing, call it off. Then he changes his mind the next day. So when he dies, Henry then is already in his majority at 18, and within 2 months, he had unwound all the years of scheming that his father had made and, married Catherine for love. Now, the Henry that we have this time is different than the fat, imposing,
right,
the somewhat tyrannical portrait we get from Holbein, where Holbein very brilliantly takes Henry's fat rolls and turns it into a symbol of power, as opposed to something unflattering. And so this Henry is young, he's thin, and he's pious. At the British Library, you can see it online, they have it, Henry VIII's bead roll. Do you know what a bead roll is?
No. Bead roll?
A bead roll, as it's called. And so what that is it's a canvas or a vellum wrap of basically prayers and images written and painted on it. And it's basically a prayer book, a medieval prayer book without the bindings. It's a traditional form of a book that was still around in those times. So it would be rolled up, and you'd unroll parts of it like a scroll in ancient times, and you'd say, so you could say your prayers. And Henry even writes a few notes there to his body servant. If you, master will say your prayers for me, and I will say prayers for you, and God will bless us both. Right? And he wrote that. He was very young. It is written in the margins there. And they have a lot of prayers. Your obvious prayers, your Pater Noster,
all Latin, I presume.
The Creed, the hymns, all in Latin, parts of the office, and other things. And so it's Henry's first introduction both to Latin and to religious worship. And so it's interesting, it's very much in the tradition of the Middle Ages, so many prayers for protection from sudden death, which, as Catholics today, we should reverence and revere, although, modern scholars consider these things, superstitious and what have you. So, so this is what, you can see that it's in the British Library, Henry VIII's bead roll. If I can, later on I can find it if you want to stick a link in so people can view that. The Latin's a bit hard to read because it's written by hand, but depending on how advanced your paleography is. But nevertheless, so Henry is very pious. He comes to the throne pious, and he decides he's going to do something very different from his father. He is going to have a kingdom set up on virtue, on joy, on games and parties, rather than the tyrannical regime that Henry VII kept up. Because for Henry VII, his father, it was simple. It's like, well, I got these Yorkists that want to kill me, so I'm going to tax them to death. I'm going to make sure they can't do anything because they'd be too poor and too overburdened to do it, and I'm going to fill the jails with anybody who steps out of line, which he did. And, Henry, on the other hand, he was always hanging around the tilting yards, right? He was never allowed to joust, but he's always hanging about with the Yorkists. It's like the equivalent today of, hanging around the locker room with, the people your dad doesn't like and making friends with them, with their parents and whatnot. And that's basically what Henry does. He's hanging out with the Yorkists, so they look upon him as one of their mates. So when Henry comes to the throne, there is zero opposition. And part of that, the policies of his father, but also that the other side loves him, right? And so there's no real serious danger in Henry's accession that there's going to be any kind of Yorkist uprising or anything, because they're all like, hey, we love him. Why would we want to fight against him? He's our mate. And that's one of the things that helps Henry as he comes along, right? And so Thomas More, St. Thomas More, is at this time was a lawyer in London. And More's history is very interesting, and we could go on at length, there's biographies, but essentially, to sum it up super quick, he loved the classics, especially Greek, and if he could have, that's all he would have done, but his father basically got out of, no, you're going to be a lawyer. Get on with the law stuff. So he does, begrudgingly. Tries a vocation, finds that he's not fit to it, and becomes a lawyer practicing in London for the city. So in all the boroughs are kind of divided. They have even their own government in London, a lot of the city boroughs. So the borough of Cheapside gets Thomas More to give a special oration in their honor to Henry as his coronation parade gets on. It's in Latin first. There's an original copy of it in the royal possession. I believe that's in the British Library as well, or else it's in the Bodleian. I've seen it, it's digitized. I've seen it there, but anyway, so Thomas, in there he says, now ends the reign of the winter king, and that's the phrase now we get for Henry VII. More is the one who actually coins it. And then he says, but now comes the end of our sorrow, the end of our slavery. For now we have a new king whose chief aim is not money, but the gold of virtue and honor and justice. But how long? Of course, more we'll find out in about 25 years or so exactly how long that's going to last. But in the meantime, so Henry comes, and his main interest is youth and games and play. So everyone knows the song "Pastime with Good Company." Even if you don't know the name by such, everyone's heard it. It's actually not a hymn. It's a song, a court song that Henry VIII himself composed, and everyone's heard it. If you have a medieval CD, at some point you've heard this, right? And it's interesting, so it's singing about the joy of good company and everything. And at the end it says, "Who shall me let?" Now, in the 16th century English and early modern English, "who shall me let" means the opposite of what it does today. It means who's going to stop me. Let means stop, not permit, like we think of it now. So, and what he's referring to is his privy council. And this is, of course, Archbishop Warham, Bishop Fox, and a handful of others that are all holdovers from his father. And they're trying to put the brakes, basically, on anything he wants to do. They have the Courts of the Seals. And Henry's very non-confrontational. He is not, he can get downright angry and tyrannic when he wants to, but he's just not a confrontational guy. He doesn't like getting into fights with people. And so it's in this mix that one Thomas Wolsey comes into the picture. Now, Wolsey was an almoner for Bishop Fox. Previously, he had been the son of an Ipswich butcher. And in the local documents you can find there in Ipswich, the inn that his father ran next to his butcher shop was also fined every year for keeping an unclean house. That meant that he had a little bordello attached to it. So for Wolsey to escape this kind of situation, there's only one way out. That's the free monastic schools that are offered all over England, where the monks will teach you Latin, or those pensioned by them, and you'll learn the basic course, which again St. John Fisher, whom we're going to talk about, had, which some more had, which even Henry had. Essentially, first is Latin, and then grammar, and then rhetoric. Grammar, logic, and rhetoric, right? And those are all the things you learn. And that's what Wolsey would have learned, and that's learning Latin. He was brilliant in it. He moves up. He gets to this position where he's an almoner, and then he's sent to put the brakes on Henry. Make sure he's not jousting. Make sure he's not doing these things. And Wolsey quickly learns the way to get to power with Henry is to get Henry what he wants. And so instead of putting the brakes on Henry, he facilitates all the things Henry wants to do. First it's jousting, then it's getting rid of the Courts of the Seals, then it's war with France. And that's the main goal that Henry has, to restart the 100 Years' War like his hero. So this is not quite the same Henry that we're thinking of in 1531 or so. All right. So, and nevertheless, it was one of the people that was big in Henry VII's circle, disappears under Henry VIII, but becomes important in other circles, is St. John Fisher. And so I should move to mention him now. Fisher was born during the Wars of the Roses. He's about 10 years older or so than Thomas More. And he was in a town called Beverly, which is a wool merchant's town, and they had managed to keep their neutrality during the Wars of the Roses, so they did not get into, get completely destroyed like some other English towns. Fisher had a decent education. His father died young, but his mother remarried to a stepfather that did right by him, and so they saw how brilliant he was, and they sent him off, to Cambridge. At that time, the learning wasn't so good, but Fisher became quite outstanding very quickly, especially in Latin and other things. In 1491, he took his master's degree and he was ordained to the priesthood. And he was actually given a papal dispensation because he was below the canonical age to be ordained. But he quickly turned out to be an excellent man of high talent and high virtue, to the point where he was on university business, and he happened to be invited to a dinner with then Cardinal Morton, because it was 1490 still, and Lady Margaret Beaufort, we mentioned earlier. So this is Henry VII's mother, Henry VIII's grandmother. Now, she was very pious, She translated a number of books in spiritual life in French. She heard Mass 3 times a day. And so she got from Fisher, once her husband died. Fisher,
She heard Mass 3 times a day?
Vow of chastity. 3 times a day.
She wouldn't receive, though, right?
So that's, no.
Probably not.
I believe it was a couple of times. I wouldn't, just by judging by the practice in those times, because I don't know anything specific to her, you would get permission a couple times a week. And it was one of those that we were very nervous that if you receive too often, then the things that are holy, they'd be like casting pearls before swine. You get all these holy things and you start to take them less seriously. Oh, isn't that funny? It's kind of what's happening today, right? Although we should strive for frequent communion, but we should strive for frequent communion with devotion. And that's why the spiritual masters in the past were always very cautious when they gave frequent communion, and to make sure that your soul was ready for that step to take communion very, very frequently, so that it would not become this mundane thing. And hopefully during the period we're in now, people are not taking it for granted that people are hungering with devotion for the Eucharist more and more, since at the present, given our circumstances with the virus pandemic and everything, we can't get it. So nevertheless, anyways, back to this. So Margaret Beaufort makes St. John Fisher her chaplain, and he's noted for his holiness in the court. He has no other connections whatsoever, no royal connections. He's a commoner. And Henry VII is really impressed, and he looks at bad appointments he's made to the church. He's looked at bad things he's done, and he says, I need to do something to make up for this. I need to get right with God. So I'm going to start appointing holy men to be bishops. And so he cites one, he takes Fisher and he says, I've observed you. And some people thought, well, it's just his mother's chaplain, more cronyism, right? But then Henry VII actually wrote a letter to someone who asked about it. He said, no, my mother never asked me to make him a bishop. In fact, she would have opposed it because she wanted to keep him as her chaplain. It's rather his holiness is so good, he's just the right man to get to make him a bishop. So now bishops in this time, it's important to understand, one of the biggest problems that you'll see addressed at the Council of Trent is episcopal absenteeism. Bishops that live somewhere else. Now, if you're a bishop in those times, basically you're living at court, or you're at a university, or you're at, so living it up in some other city, usually Rome, Paris. So in England, it's going to be royal business, diplomatic business, whatnot. You'll never see your diocese. And that's an abuse that crept in, from certain systems set up in the Middle Ages where, the bishop doing this and that was seen as kind of an exception. Then it gradually becomes the rule. So without episcopal oversight, things just start to fall apart in local dioceses, because then what happens? The bishop takes the income and he needs it for wherever he's living. So there's only pennies left, and now whoever the vicar is over the diocese, he's got to scrounge for whatever money he can to run things, so the priests aren't properly being paid. When the priests are not properly being paid, they suffer very much, or they get into trouble. And then you can see things like the Bogus priest, who goes around, the foil of Chaucer and all these medieval writers, he goes around saying, setting up an altar and some bread and doing about the equivalent of pig Latin, and then turning around and saying, okay, I just did the Mass, pay me. Right? And so this is a major problem. In Milan, by the time St. Charles Borromeo took over, there had been no bishop in Milan for about 125 years.
Right.
So the priesthood had gotten to such a state that the saying used to be, si vuole andare all'inferno, sere un prato. If you want to go to hell, be a priest. That's what they used to say in Milan. That's how bad it got.
Yeah.
England never quite got that bad. It was one of the better countries as things were, but there were a lot of issues still in the system, canonical laws, and how those affected people. Right. So Fisher gets into his diocese, very small diocese, Rochester, and he has to divide his time a little bit because he's also the chancellor at Cambridge, and we're not going to be able to talk much about that today, but his work at Cambridge, but just a few things. But nevertheless, and he's also, at Royal Court, because bishops are also in the House of Lords, so that means they have to go to London, they have to come back, and what have you. So what happens to Fisher is that he sees the state of his diocese. He sees that people need to be fed spiritually. And so he starts preaching. And somebody asked him, well, why are you preaching? Bishops don't preach. And he said, if I don't preach to the people, I'll be damned. And that's really powerful, especially in those times. You never heard a bishop preach, except to, royalty or whatever.
So Fisher was out in the countryside. Let me pause here. There's an interesting parallel to our own time, because in this era, 16th century, the bishops were attached to the political power and were receiving large amounts of money from the state and were perceived by the people as absentee, not part of the pastoral ministry of the local diocese. What does that sound like in 2020? Most, at least in America, and I think it's probably true in parts of Europe, most of us do not perceive our bishops as local pastors. We see them as putting their hands into the pie and getting the money. We see them as receiving government funding. And then we have, certain local priests that are edifying, and the lay people all gravitate to those. Then there's all these other priests who seem to be heretical, and, they give sermons that are equivalent to Methodist puppy sermons. No doctrine, no dogma, no meat, nothing. So, I mean, it's a different era, but a similar problem. And what I think is interesting here is as the decades roll on in the 16th century, you reach a point where the states want to formalize this problem and have all the bishops working for the state. This is the end game in the 16th century, and that's called Protestantism. Right. Could that, I mean, we'll come back to the history in a sec, but I want to hear your thought on this, Ryan. Could that be our current situation? I mean, we had the bishops shutting down sacraments, public rites, public worship, public mass before even the state asked them, but trying to conform with state regulations, even the Pope himself trying to conform with the secular regulations. Are we going to a globalist UN arrangement where the church is just sort of a nonprofit charitable arm to make us feel spiritual?
It's definitely what some people want, let's put it that way, and it looks like certain people that are in power are moving into that direction. How far Christ will let that go, I guess we're going to see. But in terms of the bishops serving the political power, this is, in my opinion, that's absolutely true in everything except the royals. We don't need the royals, and they're still serving the political power willingly, actually. Let's just do, you look at the topics of discussion at the USCCB, for example, and you have similar issues in other countries, just adjusted for their local situation. But in this country, USCCB, nuclear disarmament, immigration. Oh, and we get money for resettling immigrants. So therefore, we want more immigration because it's funding our books because most Catholics aren't giving because we're not inspiring. But never mind. We need the money from the government. So what we have to do as bishops, they say, we need to look at these government issues. And so with the shutdowns, I'm not quite ready to say that suspending public mass was absolutely the wrong thing. There could be reasons for it. I don't like it, but I do wish other things were tried first. And you see innovative priests coming up with them. You can't do it everywhere, but you can do it in some places. Parking lot masses, large outdoor gatherings, like during Spanish influenza, for example. They did, in fact, close many churches, but also wherever they could, they did mass outside. They did it in Boston, in the city itself. They did an open-air outdoor mass. So it would be nice, at least, if the bishops pushed for these things. And then you see certain bishops, I can't pillory all of them because you're not all doing this, but some of them are. No confessions. We don't want confession because that'll transmit these diseases. And that's, again, there's things that can be tried to mitigate the danger of any kind of contagion and still give people the sacraments. And it seems like we have a lot of priests who want to innovate, who want to continue to bring the sacraments to the people. And you get a lot of bishops that are immediately hunkering down and hiding like hirelings. Oh, no, don't do that. No, everyone hide. Don't give the sacraments. So in those days, it was very similar. If you had a similar thing, I mean, Pope John the 22nd, he was an Avignon Pope in, I forget the year, but during the Black Plague, he actually suspended the public celebration of Holy Week in the Avignon court. It was just private. All visitors were kept out. A lot of times the Pope would just hide, not even let servants into his chambers, just have to leave food outside the door, and just kind of disappeared.
So,
So
but that
for
was
the whole
that
year,
was an
he didn't
anti-pope,
minister any
correct?
church business. No, he was a pope. John the 22nd was a valid.
John
Not
2:2.
23rd during the schism, 22nd.
Okay.
Right.
Okay. So so this is very important because several times on the Taylor Marshall show I've said, to my knowledge, this is the first time Holy Week has been private since the time of Constantine. You're saying I'm wrong. That actually happened in the court of John the 22nd.
I've seen references to it. There was a direction given, and I'm fairly certain it was carried out. Because there's a whole year where John the 22nd just disappeared and didn't do any public business whatsoever. So
Okay.
I can't think of any other time where, but then again, too, Avignon, you didn't always have massive amounts of faithful coming there all the time and whatnot.
Right.
So,
but I heard,
but
just a side point,
so,
I've heard that in Avignon, the popes even did sort of a ad hoc stational church. They would like set up a chapel and they'd be like, oh, okay, this is St. Mary Major. We're doing the stational church. And this is, the Lateran. And this is Santa Jerusalem. Is that true?
I've seen a reference to it, but I haven't seen what you would call hard evidence, any kind of manuscript relation or letters referring to it. I wouldn't be surprised if that were true, but it was sort of ridiculous. But
right. Okay, so we got John Fisher. He's a chaplain for the mother. He's a pious guy. He goes to Rochester. He starts preaching. Let's get up towards the schism. So Catherine of Aragon isn't bearing Henry VIII a boy. He's got a girl he likes on the side, wants to marry her. He says, look, I married my brother's sister. She probably had sex with my brother. This is contrary to the laws of consanguinity in the Catholic Church. The Pope should have never allowed me to marry my brother's sister. It's kind of icky, non-canonical. So I just need a quickie annulment so that I can marry this other chick. You get that right?
More or less, that's the case. Yep. So more or less, the interesting thing is, what would Henry VIII have done if there was no Anne Boleyn? Well, it would have been somebody else.
Yeah, I was going to say, just be another chick.
And that's part of the history. It would just be someone else. He'd already had several affairs. Even early on in the marriage, after a couple of years, Elizabeth Blount, she was a very early mistress. So Henry was, not always, faithful marriage-wise. He'd failed as a war king. He'd fought battles in France. He'd won, but he could never take a great deal of territory. The thing that precipitates all of this, there's two things. So the first is the onset of Lutheranism in Germany. So in how it comes in, we won't talk so much about Luther today, but how it comes into England. Tracts of Luther are coming in, but the biggest thing is that Henry decides to write a book against Luther, The Defense of the Seven Sacraments, which is actually still a great book, by the way. And in the preamble, he sits down and he writes a very brave, at that time, very bold defense of papal supremacy. And now Thomas More, who's editing the book for Henry, who's helping him keep, papers together and put together stuff from the theologians so Henry could deploy it in the book. He goes to Henry and he says, my lord, do you really want to put this defense of the Pope in here? And Henry says, well, of course I did. And then More says, it's 1522. And More says, well, what happens if later you and the Pope should come into loggerheads over something? And of course, he's saying, he's thinking in terms of politics. He's not foreseeing so much what's about to happen, although he is prophetic. And so Henry says, well, even so, I should still defend papal supremacy. And the truth is, More did not believe at this time the papacy was a divine office. He thought it was a merely human office, like his colleague and friend Erasmus. And
Right.
Henry believed it was a divine office. And in 10 years, that will completely flip for different reasons. So for Henry, there's two things that cause this to happen. So Lutheranism's one, and the influence and also the possibilities that gives you if you break from the church. And the biggest thing that brings that to mind is there's a legal case with a certain guy named Richard Hunn. You see him in Fox's Book of Martyrs and things like that, and Acts and Monuments of Fox. Hunn was essentially sued a clergyman, and then I forget, he was put in jail, and then he dies in jail. He hangs himself. So something looked suspicious about it, and the coroner's jury indicted a clergyman for the murder. All right, and so this goes through, but they claim right of clergy and that they can't be tried by the secular court. So it goes round and round. And finally, and Henry's present for this, the Lord Chancellor rules in favor of the crown and says that, well, technically, by the law of praemunire, everything belongs to the crown anyway, all the churches and everything. Technically, the king's in charge of all these things. And so the importance of this suddenly dawned on Henry. This is 1525, the Richard Hunn case. This dawns on Henry. Legally in England, I am in control of the church, eh? That's interesting. Put this away for later. And then you have the failure of the Spanish alliance again. So now you have Charles V rather than Ferdinand, his grandfather.
Right. And
Charles V promises Henry the moon because there's a revolt that happens in Spain, the Comuneros revolt. The people are tired of Charles living as the Holy Roman Empire and sucking money out of Spain. So they put
Charles
up his mother.
Charles V is the Habsburg Holy Roman Emperor, correct?
Right. Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
And I could go into all the genealogy, but he basically owns half of Europe right now. And he surrounds the French. So in Spain, there's a revolt. They revolt against him, and not the whole country, but a good portion of the nobility. So he has to get back somehow, but he can't cross French territory. So he needs the ocean. And there's one guy who runs the ocean in that part of the world, and that's Henry. So Charles goes hat in hand, betroths himself to Henry's daughter Mary. He promises he will make Cardinal Wolsey Pope. He'll pay all the money that's owed by Ferdinand, and he'll get a military alliance against the French. Now, Henry's just been over in France and signed a treaty of perpetual peace. So it shows how quick the alliances shift. And so Henry is just like, wow, that's great. So Charles promises the moon, but he failed to deliver. The next year, Henry's troops were in the field in France. Charles never materialized. The year after that, Henry's troops are in France again within striking distance of Paris. Charles does not materialize. Then he gets 1525, the Battle of Pavia, and Henry said, I'm going to sit this whole thing out. Charles isn't going to show up. Well, Charles does end up entering the battlefield, and he defeats the French king Francois I at Pavia, and now takes him as prisoner. So Henry realizes that, I didn't have troops in the field. So he writes to try, he scrambles to get as much money as he can to get an army together and get them out. And there's just not enough money. Parliament actually won't grant heavier taxation. He's taxing the churches, he's taxing everything, and it doesn't do much for him. And so again, Wolsey comes up with this idea, the spin doctor in chief, calls it the amicable grant. It was a forced loan from the nobility, which they would then take out of their peasants. Nobody liked that. People were revolting. People were, no, we can't have that. So Henry is finally like, okay. So he writes a letter to Charles. Please, let's partition France. Let's get rid of the Valois dynasty and just split the country up between us. But Charles likes having Henry as a tipping point between him and the French. He doesn't want to create Henry as an equally powerful rival. So he says, nah, you want your part of France, you take it. Oh, by the way, forget that betrothal to Mary. I'm going to marry this Austrian princess here. Catherine is utterly humiliated. Her marriage with Henry, the last thing remaining was this Spanish alliance. And now that's brought Henry nothing. Right. Bubkiss. He's out of luck. So
and let me ask something.
He doesn't even talk.
Isn't Charles V the uncle of Catherine of Aragon?
No, the nephew.
Nephew, yeah, okay.
He's the nephew of Catherine of Aragon.
Sorry,
yeah. So but nevertheless, he's much younger at this time, and we go on and on about that. But that's what ticks off Henry about the Spanish match. So now he's looking for whatever else he could do, and at first, and Wolsey gets to be a part of it. He's looking afield to France for royal brides for Henry. He has no idea that Henry's already got somebody in mind, right? And so that's the hammer falls on the thing. So the first thing they do, actually, is once they have a meeting, and Henry it's this weird play where Henry puts a nobleman up to declaring to him that his marriage to his wife is not valid.
Right.
Because he married his brother's widow, which is forbidden in Leviticus. Mm-hmm. So Wolsey then says, oh my, this is a hard case. And he starts canvassing the support of the bishops of the realm. And then he goes to St. John Fisher. So Fisher was one of the most preeminent theologians in England. A lot of people don't know this, and not just in England, but in the whole of Europe. And when Luther had written against Henry, couldn't technically respond because Luther uses all sorts of abuse, bad language, F-bomb in Latin, all these things against Henry. And so Henry cannot, technically by royal protocol, even notice such a thing. Yes. So he enlists More, and then eventually he enlists, because it wasn't good enough, because More descends to the very same level as Luther and uses the very same F-bombs in Latin against Luther under a pen name. And then
by the way, what is the F-bomb in Latin? Is it fucare? What is it?
Fuecere.
Spell it.
Fuecere. Fuecere. You love it starts with an FU.
Okay.
So but anyway,
it means. Doesn't that mean to ram? Originally,
it has that. That's part of its relation. So
it eventually comes to be more of that. But I don't know. It's kind of interesting to talk about cussing in Latin. People like this.
To commit sodomy.
Say again.
I know. Right? There's irrimere, which is another version of it, but that means sodomy.
Okay. Right. Yeah, but our F word actually comes from the Latin F word. Isn't that right?
I believe so. I'm not so up on the etymology of that. I'll leave that to others who are into the etymology of curse words and swear words.
Because I looked it up at one point.
So Fisher enters.
Oh, hold on. I want to stay on the F word real quick. I looked it up at one point, and the first time that we know of the F word being used in English was in reference to English monks committing adultery. Mm-hmm. It's the first recorded use of it in the English language. And it seems to derive from this Latin term. Anyway, just interesting.
Yeah, that's what I'm pretty certain it does. But anyway.
And so you're saying that Luther
there's books on that. So.
Luther in the 1500s was already using the F-bomb in Latin?
Mm-hmm.
All right. Cool.
And so he had very bad language, notoriously.
Oh, yeah.
Luther did. Yeah. It's noted, the Cambridge History of the English Church, I believe it was Cambridge or was it Oxford? I forget. Mm-hmm. Or the History of Protestantism. They note Luther's bad language, and even Bullinger, Henry Bullinger, later Protestant, was kind of embarrassed by Luther's language. And he said, well, a swineherd could be expected to speak so, but not so much a prophet. Right? Mm-hmm. Right. So even on the Protestant side, there's criticism of Luther for that. So anyway,
right.
Excuse me. Didn't get enough.
Anyway, it's good because you're into the Latin, especially the Latin in the 16th century. So it's good to talk to someone who knows these things.
Fisher writes back. So he writes two treatises, one against Luther's book, The Babylonian Captivity, and the second in defense of the Catholic priesthood, both in defense of Henry's book, right? Which are both marvelous works, even better than Henry's, easily better than Henry's. And Fisher is just singularly the best pre-Tridentine witness to the best in theology at that time. And his work against Luther is so damning that Luther doesn't even respond. He always responds to everybody. This time, he's up against the holiest bishop in Christendom. Everybody knows it. So he can't, talk about his morals. He can't talk about, Fisher not feeding the people, because Fisher is in the fields, feeding, giving the people the word. He's out in the villages giving the last sacrament, something no bishops have heard of doing in hundreds of years, right? In houses that are smoky and nobody else will go into, Fisher goes into them to anoint people and hear their confessions and all these sorts of things. So there's nothing Luther can really say in his normal mode, and then he'd have to deal with the arguments. So he just ignores them. Then Fisher has a bigger book, which is not yet in English, and it's called, the very long title, all the titles in these times are very long, but essentially, the refutation of the assertions of the articles of Martin Luther, to pass over the rest. And so what that is Luther, when he was condemned by Pope Leo X, in Exsurge Domine, he has, various propositions of Luther that are condemned, various articles. So Luther burns the bull, burns the entire corpus of canon law, and reasserts all his articles in a particular pamphlet. So Fisher takes these point by point, quotes them at length, and then refutes them. The whole thing is like 800 pages in the Latin. It's very, very long. It's also the one place, if you want to know what Fisher's theology is on almost anything, it's the place to go. Because on Our Lady and Purgatory and all these various things where he's defending against Luther, right? So he's considered an outstanding theologian. So Wolsey is really keen to get Fisher on his side to defend that Henry's marriage was never valid, was always null and void. So Fisher sits down, he looks at this issue, and he says, well, the difficulty is the fathers read Leviticus in union with the verse in Deuteronomy, which tells you to marry your brother's wife. And he says essentially that if childless, then you would do so to, raise up children to her name, to the brother's name. So that such a thing would be perfectly illicit, not against the law of God. Right, and so Fisher again looks and says, part of the problems with the bull, and he has a kind of a question about it, but he starts doing some research, and then he becomes convinced that Henry and Catherine's marriage was valid. And this is a big problem for Wolsey and for Henry. So, in the early biographer of Fisher, from about 1550s or so, this was written. He says that Fisher was called in by Henry, and Henry asked him, and mentioned he had doubts in conscience, and Fisher is very quick to ask. He said, "My lord, may I have permission to clear your conscience?" And then he goes and lays down the entire, case theologically for why the marriage with Catherine was good and valid. And because of that, according to the early biographer, Henry never looked upon him with favor again.
Mm.
Right, which surprised, because he's already made up his mind. He's just looking for the answer that he wants. So in all the years that Fisher spent tutoring Henry when he was a miserable fat 8-year-old. Don't seem to matter anymore because Henry's not getting what he wants. Right. Now it moves to the next stage. So Wolsey was the cardinal legatine. He's the Pope's representative. He could have legally given the annulment right there in the Pope's name, and the Pope would probably not have reversed it.
Okay.
But he stops, whether it was a pinch of conscience or there was a sense that he's gone too far. Nobody really knows. So,
can I ask a quick question?
The case is too difficult.
Can I ask a quick question on that matter? So I understood, and maybe I'm wrong, that all royal annulments have to go to the what's the legal highest court in Rome? I blanked out on it.
At that time, that would have been the Rota.
The what?
Today, we would say the Signatura.
Yeah, the Signatura.
I'm not sure.
I thought all royal annulments had to run through the Signatura.
One of those. Traditionally, they did, unless the Pope had granted the faculties to a cardinal in a different country to deal with it.
Okay.
So when Wolsey and Henry connived to make Wolsey a cardinal back in 1518, and they even got from Pope Leo X very generous powers, given to Wolsey, and some of those powers included the right, to deal with all annulment cases arising in England. And it was very, the terms were distributed. It was very clearly all cases, right? So it was a far bigger grant than usual, but Henry was willing to pay up for it. So the Pope gave it, right? So also part of the corruption of the times you're living in. The popes were paying for Raphael, paying for Michelangelo, trying to rebuild St. Peter's. Wherever they could get the money in those days, they would. I would think Philip Hughes, great Reformation historian, probably one of the greatest in England, he said that the main chief objective of the papacy in this time was to make money. And unfortunately, that's true. And that's really what they were about. Granted, we got Raphael, we got Michelangelo, but the spiritual needs of Christendom were very much being neglected. So Wolsey had this power, and he was the Pope's official representative in England. He could have gotten away with it. Technically, it's one of those things that he should be talking to the Pope about it, but he could do it. And anyway, something happens. He just has this pinch of conscience. Maybe this is going too far. And so he decides the whole case is too hard, and he relates it to Rome for judgment. But he assures Henry, don't worry, I've got my contacts in Rome. We're going to push this right through. And it might have happened except that it was bad timing. Now the year is 1527, and the sack of Rome takes place. Charles V's drunken soldiery. Charles, the Pope at this time now, Clement VII, he had decided to back the French instead of the Empire.
Right.
So Charles V gets ticked off. He sends his troops within striking distance as a warning, not a good idea. And then the payment for those troops goes into arrears. They get drunk and mutiny, and they just sack the whole city of Rome, bring absolute devastation to it. So the Pope has to flee to Castel Sant'Angelo, and while he's hiding in there, Charles V, he orders the soldiers, well, let's not let a crisis go to waste. Let's take, our chance to put our will and our influence on the good Pope. So Clement VII, even if he wanted to grant the annulment, Charles V would not have allowed it. So it's only when Clement manages to escape to Florence, Florentine protection, that he stops, and then he says, all right, let's look at your, he gets Wolsey's men in there and says, all right, I'll send the cardinal in there, and we'll discuss this matter. We'll figure out, what the story is here, right? So then that's where the legatine court gets in. They send in Cardinal Campeggio, and Campeggio technically was a beneficed bishop in England, but absentee. And so he comes into the country, and of course, he's also being paid off by Charles V in the background, but nobody knows that yet. And, he examines the case. He has a brief from the Pope to make no certain judgment, dilly things out, because maybe things will take care of themselves. The first thing he does is offer Catherine, hey, be a nun. And just that'll solve all the problems. Just renounce the whole thing, be a nun. You'll be well provided for, I'm sure. And she's absolutely not. I'm the daughter of Isabella. I'm supposed to be a queen. Yeah. I was not made to be a nun. So that's out. And now the legatine court begins. And this is the interesting thing. So everyone, likes to say Thomas More's a defender of marriage. Thomas More did, in fact, hold that that marriage was good and that Catherine was being wronged. Hilaire Belloc, for example, in his history, gets this completely wrong as he infers it from later actions. We'll talk about it again when we get there. So More, but he decides to kind of sit in the background. He doesn't want to do anything overtly, because he also knows very much who Henry is and what he's like. So he doesn't want to be seen publicly venting. The one guy who stands out in public, literally putting his neck out on the block, is Fisher.
Yes.
St. John Fisher had actually written probably about 6 different tracts on it. So he shows up at the legatine court when Henry thinks he's got the acquiescence of all the bishops. And Fisher gets up and says no, and he gives a whole statement on why this marriage is valid, why it's good, and even declares, like a new St. John the Baptist, I am willing to lay down my life for the validity of this marriage, which is exactly what will happen. And a couple years down the road. So that throws the whole thing into disarray. And then there's all sorts of discussion, and then they try to get new witnesses. Catherine, of course, has her famous scene where she pleads for Henry. The text you find in Shakespeare is largely taken from one of the Moore biographers, Harpsfield. So I believe Harpsfield. Maybe I'm wrong about that. But anyway, so that text is authentic that you find in Shakespeare's Henry VIII, that Catherine pleads for Henry in the legatine court and whatnot.
And cries, right?
Nevertheless. So
is it true?
Yes.
She's like on her knees crying, I'm your wife, I'm your wife. Don't send me away.
It's not certain whether she was actually in tears. The early accounts don't give those details. But I would have a hard... whether she could produce those for acting or she's really devoutly crying, either way, you would imagine you would be in this situation. But nevertheless, Campeggio, after they look at the evidence, Wolsey's pushing Campeggio to make a decision. Wolsey doesn't even know that Campeggio's got a brief from the Pope saying, don't make any decisions. So Wolsey, lets it sit for a while. Henry's getting impatient, and then finally declares that the whole case has to be brought back to Rome for judgment. You and Henry and Anne, you have to wait longer. In the meantime, while Henry's pleading his conscience, somebody gets a hold of letters, and it was a concerted effort because they got both the letters between Henry and to Anne and Anne back to Henry. And these find their way to Rome, to the Pope. So he is sitting on these love letters between Henry and Anne, and they're saying, your conscience, they challenge Henry on it. So anyway, Henry, is getting increasingly impatient. So now what he does is he sets the machinery, the legal machinery in play to basically, make the church subservient to him one way or the other. Whether that means he stays Catholic or it does not, doesn't really matter at this point. So the first thing he does is Wolsey is arrested for treason. Wolsey is stripped of being the High Chancellor because he didn't, this was one time he did not get Henry what he wanted.
Right.
So Wolsey belatedly goes back to his diocese, and then Henry sets up a treason trial for him, and he dies before that can take place. Famously saying, if only I'd served my God as well as I served my king.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So he dies. Now Thomas More is brought in to be the chancellor, and immediately questioned on the annulment proceeding. Where do you stand? And he listens to everyone on Henry's side, and More and Frank says, I'm not convinced, but if you want me to be your chancellor, I will be your chancellor. I will not argue directly for this, but I won't fight it either, because I'm your man and I respect you. And Henry, who knew More, said, yep, he's probably the most upright guy I could possibly get. That's the best I could get from him. At least I know he's a man of his word. But it was awkward, because people would ask More what he thought, and he'd be silent, and he'd say, yeah, that's what I figured. You're not in favor of all this. And then Henry starts moving. So without Wolsey in play anymore, because Wolsey dominated the church, stopped efforts at reform, tried to extract money out of people. So now the church has a moment to breathe without Wolsey dominating it. So Bishop Warham takes his place as Archbishop of Canterbury during the convocation, and Henry sends a minister. So remember that earlier thing with Richard Hunn. Henry kind of says, aha, praemunire, which is a law going back to Edward I, the Longshanks. Remember him in Braveheart. Not a historically accurate movie, but anyway. Edward I. He makes this law, especially that you can't appeal to the Pope. The king is in charge of the church in England. And that was during a series of wars and conflicts in the Middle Ages. And the law just sat dormant. Nobody thought about it. So now Henry makes use of it. And he tells all the clergy, by accepting Wolsey's legatine authority as a cardinal, you all committed praemunire. And that means you all are felons, and all your property forfeit to the crown, unless you'll pay, X amount of money. And by the way, we want this title. We want you to affirm the king is the head of the Church of England. So,
right.
Fisher is the one who comes. Most of the clergy are scared. They don't know what to do. If they all universally resisted right then, it would have been, Henry would have had to try a different means to come about this. But instead, everyone's scared. Even Warham, he's fumbling over, doesn't know what to do. So Fisher says, why don't, we have to reject this, but nobody's really doing anything, because what they want is their Archbishop of Canterbury to do something. And he doesn't. So Fisher says, at least let's do it this way. We'll give him this title with the qualifying clause, as far as the law of Christ permits. And so with that, they say, all right, yeah, we'll do that. So Henry's ticked off at first, but he says, what, I could still make bank out of this. Let's sit on this for a while. So then you call, so before More was the High Chancellor, he had opened the 1529 Parliament. So now he's the Lord High Chancellor, and that Parliament becomes what's known now in history books as the Reformation Parliament, because they would pass all the laws that would pave the way for the break with Rome. So the first is, of course, things supposing to reform the church. So one of those is the repeal of annates. This is a fun word. So annates is this weird tax, probably served some purpose in the Middle Ages, so they'd outgrown it now, where a bishop would have to pay his first year's income to the Pope. And then the Pope would have that money, right? It's detested tax, right? And throughout the 15th century, they're trying to get rid of it. And it became something the Curia just depended too much on. So they get in, and the English Parliament gets in and abolishes annates. But they don't really abolish it. Instead, now it has to be paid to Henry and not to the Pope. And annates wouldn't even be abolished for 200-300 years more after the Church herself had abolished it. Which is, the fun part about the English Reformation is it doesn't actually reform anything. It actually takes the worst abuses of the Middle Ages and prolongs them for hundreds of years beyond what was even in the Roman Church. You think of like Wodehouse or Trollope, right? Barchester Towers, right? You got some poor clergymen looking to get married so you can get a better parish and a better income and all these things, right? Anyway, so they take other things in reform of the church. They forbid convocation. They forbid all appeals to the Pope. And then there was a brief period where the Pope and Henry were talking again. So Henry takes advantage of that. So Bishop Warham, who's the Archbishop of Canterbury, seems to have been a decent and worthy man in general, but not the great man that occasion really needed. And so he ordains a bishop, and then Henry says, aha, it's a violation of praemunire, we're going to get you too. And then Warham writes back, since when was it that the bishop can't ordain someone? This is what Thomas of Becket died for. Right. And so now all of a sudden he's signing the resistance, but it's too late. He dies. So Henry says, there we go. So then he takes one of Anne Boleyn's chaplains, an otherwise obscure Cambridge don named Thomas Cranmer, and he appoints him as the Archbishop of Canterbury. And in those days, the Pope just accepted whoever you appointed as long as you paid him the tax. So in spite of Nazis and everything being abolished in England, they pay that anyway to the Pope just to make sure this goes through. Now, Cranmer is installed as the Archbishop of Canterbury. Now, Cranmer is the one who influences the direction that Henry takes this. So again, he's this obscure don. He's in the Boleyn household, and he says to Henry after the failure of the legatine court and all this, he said, "You're taking this the wrong way. When we look in the Bible, we see kings and we see bishops, but we don't see popes. Do you see popes? I don't see popes in the Bible. So maybe it's not that the Pope doesn't have any authority at all. He's just the bishop in Rome. But you're king, and you're the head of the Church of England." And Henry's like, yeah, that's right. I like that. And that's really the very thing that influences the direction that's going to go.
Well,
so Cranmer then is the Archbishop of Canterbury.
Let me interject here.
1533.
So I was an Anglican priest before I was a Catholic. Mm-hmm. And everyone always says, didn't y'all know Henry VIII was a jerk and killing wives and divorcing wives? Doesn't that disprove your religion? So we had a whole apologetics on why the Church of England was legit. Mm-hmm. And it's related to what you just said, that in the Old Testament, the New Testament, the king is supreme. But also there was an appeal during this time to Henry VIII. Henry VIII saw himself as a kind of Constantine. And the court theologian says, we all recite the Nicene Creed. The first ecumenical council was great. Who called that? Well, did a pope call that, or did a king call that? Oh, it was a king. And no one can argue against that. Everyone recognizes that it was a king who paid for it, organized it, set the date, set the location. Right. Yes, a pope later ratified it, but obviously it was the king who got the business done. And so it's this precedent that Henry VIII is following. And you can, especially if you follow things on the eastern side and not the western side, you can see that there is a tradition of anointing kings and Christian kings having power and Christian kings appointing bishops and Christian kings being involved in dogmatic councils. So that's what they're appealing to. And that's what nowadays the Anglican Church is a total joke with women bishops and all sorts of aberrations. But in the 1500s, these were the kind of discussions that they were having. Right.
And actually, in the 19th century, Faber, a lot of people that know this, Father William Frederick Faber, or I always say this name backwards, Frederick William Faber, he was an Oratorian. He converted around the same time as Newman. Faber went to Italy, and he felt very challenged. He felt the pull to Rome really strongly. So he came back, and he wrote a little pamphlet in defense of the Anglican Schism and in defense of the Henry VIII and the break with Rome. And some of these arguments that you're mentioning, these are what he uses. But by the end of it, you can tell he's not really convinced. 6 months later, he's Catholic. Yeah. After publishing this little pamphlet in defense. It's hard to find. A friend of mine is a professor over in Spokane. He actually has a copy of it. But anyway, so before he became famous oratory and spiritual writer. So back to Fisher in all this. So Fisher sees where it's all going. And, so he's written several works on the subject of, Catherine, the validity of the marriage with Catherine. And so this angers, Henry, angers Anne Boleyn. So, they figured that it's time to get him by hook or by crook. Or in this case, by cook. They actually try to have Fisher poisoned. and that, the poisoning kills several people in the household, but Fisher didn't actually eat that day because he was fasting. So he's certain not to laugh at the people die, but Fisher's escaped from it. So he manages to get out of that. So that then the next time is when he's in his study, the famous study, where he'd entertained Erasmus at times, and he had all these massive books of the church fathers and whatnot. Anne Boleyn's father, Thomas Boleyn, according to one account, shot a cannon. On another account, shot an arquebus through the window, shattered the glass and everything. And so Fisher took the hint. This isn't so much Lambeth's not too much of a safe place for me at this point, so I better get moving. So he gets back into his diocese, and then a bunch of things happen. He's arrested on a bill of attainder because there's this local seer that claims that Henry's throne will be taken away from him if he goes through the divorce.
This is really interesting.
Elizabeth Barton, the nun of Kent.
The nun of Kent.
It is. So her visions were approved by Bishop Warren previously. And so she prophesied different things. But this is why the Bollandists call her le femme non sot. She's, if I'm saying the French right, she's just not quite in her right, mind. And
I had also heard that St. John Fisher was a big believer in her prophecies. Is that true?
He was.
The nun of Kent.
To a point. The nun of Kent, to a point. And he was more of a wait and see. When you see Reynolds, if you want to know more about Fisher, all the intimate details of him as a bishop, I actually published the only biography currently in print on Fisher by E. Reynolds.
Okay, is that Mediatrix Press?
John Fisher, humanist reformer. Yep. If you want, I'll get you a link for that. But yeah, it's a great book, fantastic biography. And he goes through a lot of this business with the nun of Kent. So since we're running out of time, we get closer to the breaking point. So Fisher gets arrested, but he shows, hey, I didn't have anything to do with her revelations. She said she told the king. What else did I have to do? So he gets let go, but then it comes down. So Cranmer, gets in, annuls the marriage between Henry and Catherine, declares they were never married, and the marriage between Henry and Anne that he is carrying out is valid. And because, the Simpsons actually satirized this very well, by the authority invested in me, by you.
By you.
So by you, more or less. So, and Cranmer's your perfect court archbishop. He'll do whatever it takes to stay in power. I mean, later on in the Henry schism, he'll burn people who believe the very same things he believes for believing the very same things he believes. Just because he knows Henry's not ready to go there, so he's going to do what Henry wants. So, this happens, and then More hears about it, and he says, just give it time. They're going to confirm it with oaths, and he tells his daughter Margaret, and that's precisely what they do. So now they have the Act of Royal Succession, 1534. You have to swear the Act of Succession, which says that Henry and Anne's issue shall be the ones to ascend to the throne, not. I.e., bastardizing Queen Mary, or Princess Mary, future Queen Mary. Right. Then there's a preamble, which declares the marriage of Henry and Anne valid, and the marriage of Henry to Catherine invalid, and you have to swear that too. So they bring everyone up. Now, Thomas More had not gone to Anne Boleyn's coronation, and she was a woman that did not take slights very easily. So she orders, basically, tells Henry, you're going to get More, and he's going to be front and center swearing this thing. So, they get all these bishops up that are supposed to swear the Act of Succession, and the first one is More, Thomas More, the only layman brought out to swear this thing. And the person administering the oath is Thomas Cromwell. And we don't have time to go into Cromwell, but he's interesting in general. He was a protege of Wolsey, and he ends up surviving Wolsey's fall, and he climbs up to being Henry's Secretary of Letters. Very ingenious, very clever fellow, but anyway. So he's in this business, pushing Henry's agenda. Fisher and More then are both asked to swear the Act of Succession. And this is where Hilaire Belloc messes up. So they both say they're willing to swear to the succession because kings and parliaments, they'll decide who inherits what, and that's a normal thing, but not to the preamble. And because they wouldn't swear the preamble, they were put in the Tower. So Belloc gets from this that Thomas More was okay with the divorce, but not with the royal supremacy. He actually mixes up the dates and mixes up the documents. It's in his book, characters of Reformation, I think. This thing on Moore is completely wrong, and I'm not even sure how he got to that unless he just hadn't studied it enough. But anyway, because Fisher did it too. And Fisher definitely did not support the divorce. So anyways, and Moore didn't either. It's in his letters. It's clear. So they get sent to the tower to think it all over. So the whole painstaking year comes in where they just don't know what to do because they have them in the tower, and they are kind of this subtle point of focus for resistance to Henry on the outside. Hey, Fisher and Moore, they haven't taken the act of succession. So it's more in Henry's head than it actually is in terms of any kind of revolt. But that's where Henry's seeing it going. I mean, it's getting more and more frustrated that legally there's no legal device to kill them because they won't straight up deny, right, that legal principle of he who is silent seems to consent, right? So in that way they can preserve their consciences. And Fisher's doing it too. Even though the past Fisher has written all these writings, he refuses to say anything about it. And so this is a big problem. On top of it, the Pope makes the problem worse. Pope Paul III now, and he's a big reforming Pope, and he's putting together his good men, his cardinals that are going to be the reforming cardinals to clean up a mess, and which eventually be like Reginald Poole and Caffarec and Zerletto, people that ended up having a long pedigree of church reform. Right? So when he starts out, he wants to have Fisher as one of these men, not realizing A, how old Fisher is, and B, the problems in England. So he has his men meet with the French king, Francois I, to say, hey, what would happen? Will we be able to save him? And Francois is like, well, you can't read Henry. You don't know what he's going to do. Some days he treats me like a friend, and other days like a servant. And he's completely in his own head. I don't know what you think you're going to accomplish. So Paul III says, well, I'll make him a cardinal. And that way Henry wouldn't dare to kill a cardinal of the Roman Church. So he does, and of course that just enrages Henry, and Henry's reported to have said, well, let the Pope send his hat when he will, but he'll have to wear it on his shoulders.
Yes.
The interrogation of Fisher gets more intense after this.
Right.
Because if they could show that he had any communication, then that's treasonable under the new acts and everything, but they can't. So they're still there. So then they come up with the Act of Royal Supremacy, that you must declare, no more saving exclusionary clause, you must declare the king is the head of the Church of England on earth, Ecclesia Anglicana. And if you don't do that, it's treason. And anyone who maliciously thinks against this it's treasonable. Thought crime, essentially. And the whole act is written to convict St. Thomas More and St. John Fisher. They still don't swear anything, and they still avoiding it. So even with this act, they can't convict them. They send bishops. So Cranmer goes up, but they know Fisher won't talk to Cranmer. So they send in people that knew him, used to be friendly with him, one of his former students, Stephen Gardiner, the Bishop of Winchester, even Cuthbert Tunstall, who was a reformer like Fisher, and he'd held out for a long time, but finally he goes along with the whole thing. A couple other bishops that were known to Fisher. And then when Fisher sees that, according to the early biographer, his countenance fell, and he said, alas, the fort has been betrayed even by those who should have defended it. Mm. That's something to reflect about for our own times, because here it is, Fisher's this heroic witness, and the bishops are like, he's making us look bad, so we better go do something about it. And they go in to try to convince him to go along with Henry. So it's, again, I don't have much trouble believing that similar things would happen today. Nevertheless, then, it's hook or by crook. So according to Fisher's early biographer, and we know that they did this with Moore, as we know this from Moore's life, they send in a man that I think Harpsfield or one of Moore's relations identifies as Richard Rich, which is no surprise. We all know from that line in A Man for All Seasons. Well, allegedly Richard Rich, goes into St. John Fisher. And he says, I'm the king's trusted counselor, and, he just wants to know what you really think. It won't be used against you, we promise. And so Fisher, who's worn out and exhausted, he hasn't been given his books, he hasn't been able to say Mass, he's been locked up for a year and a half. He finally gives in, and he says, okay, I'll tell you what I think. I don't see how the king could be the head of the Church of England, et cetera, and all that. So then they go, aha, so then immediately they have a trial, kangaroo court. And then this person, which is identified as Richard Rich, he shows up saying, hey, but you told me X. And Fisher said, but in confidence with an oath, you told me this wouldn't be used. And they basically said, so what?
Yeah.
So then they take Fisher out to kill. And they use the same trick with More, except More is a little wiser. And he doesn't quite get them what they want. So they just have to come out and lie when it's done. Richard Rich is interesting because he, gets his commission, right? His royal commission. He hangs on. Then when Queen Mary becomes queen, Richard Rich became, a very, apparently fervent Catholic. No greater a Catholic there ever was, he would say. He even went to the trouble of arresting heretics, being very zealous to arrest heretics and whatnot. As soon as Elizabeth comes to the throne, Richard Rich switches sides again. and so becomes Anglican again. So that's his later history. Dies in 1581, I think. Or is it that late? That can't be that late. But it must have been 61, I was thinking. But anyway, Fisher and Moore. So Fisher is praying. He's taken early, and he declares, unlike what HBO's The Tudors, I think it is, where he's like crying, weeping. There's no historical basis for that. The early biography gives, and also Nicholas, I keep saying Nicholas Hartfield, but I know that's the wrong author. It was a relation of Moore that wrote about Fisher too. That he was, somber. That he had, come and declared that he was dying for his faith with the Roman Church. He, forgave the king and asked people to pray for God to send him a good counsel. And then, the executioner got down and begged him forgiveness for what he had to do. And, Fisher said, of course, just do your job well. and then, of course, he was beheaded. The head was taken and put on a spike on London Bridge.
Yes.
Now, Fisher didn't do any miracles in life, but in his death, he did a singular one. His head smelled like roses. So, you got to figure, too. London Bridge, horses are going across, right, pooping everywhere. In those days, it was covered, too. The people who butchered pigs and chickens in the city, they were supposed to bring the carcasses outside the city limits. Well, they never quite got so far. And oftentimes, the bridge was a dumping ground. All right, I give it up. Just dump it and run back in the city type of thing. So that place smelled. But instead, everyone reported this fragrant smell of roses that just permeated the whole place. It was a huge embarrassment to Henry. So he orders the head of Fisher to be thrown into the Thames to make room for Mr. Moore, which is next. So then that's more or less how it goes. Everyone goes along with it. And the Henrician schism is often said to be, well, he tried to keep England Catholic without the Pope. And that's just not true. No. The only thing that keeps Henry more towards a Catholic via media of sorts in external Catholicism is his hatred of Luther. And I think we talked about that last time. He hated Luther so much that he couldn't stand adopting Lutheran doctrines because of Cranmer and Cromwell, they get to him, well, get rid of the Mass. Let's make it a communion service. And so, that makes sense. Oh, but that sounds like Luther, and I hate that Luther.
Yeah.
So he never quite went there.
As I understand, Henry VIII, until his death, insisted that the Mass be in Latin.
Right.
Yeah, he did not like the vernacular.
Chant is normal. He did give way to Cranmer a little bit on that. And they did introduce, but in the royal court, in the Chapel Royale, it was always in Latin.
Yeah.
However, in the countryside, in other places, he let Cranmer experiment with English. So one of the things, big thing in Reformation theology and liturgiology is that you can't have all polyphony and all these things, they obscure the Word of God. All your texts need to be based on Scripture and one word, one voice, one note, right? Or not one voice, one note, right? So you can't have these long polyphonic Gregorian chants or either, drawing out these notes or these vowels over several notes. You can't do that. One note, one word, simple plain chant. And so Tallis, who was his monastery was suppressed in the suppression of the monasteries, he comes to looking for a job, and he gets it. So some of his English compositions actually date from this period, trying to give basically Cranmer what he wanted, and actually what he produces is still amazing. It's still because Tallis is a consummate first-rate genius, but even that wasn't enough, and you see that under Edward's reign, Cranmer even gets rid of that. And simple hymn singing of psalms and things like that. This is about the only music you could tolerate under Edward VI's reign. But anyway, so Henry's schism, the biggest mark though is the separation from the Pope, in that the sermons against papal supremacy are preached everywhere. Right. Eventually, because Henry is also against a vernacular Bible, he does not want an English Bible. And even now, even after he's broken with Rome, starting at least 1533 with the business with the marriage at the end of that year. So he is basically a very Catholic-looking Protestant, and yet he still wanted vernacular, still against a vernacular Bible. He's still, actually instrumental in getting William Tyndale burned.
Right.
So Henry then, has Anne Boleyn as his wife. Anne Boleyn does not make the transition very well from being royal mistress to being a queen. Right? She still wanted to act like a mistress and be able to tell Henry what to do. And he won't tolerate that anymore. She's got to become a queen. So one of the things she does early on is she's able to at least make a little bit of an impression on. And she sets up an English Bible in her chamber where her ladies in waiting are, and they're supposed to read from it, Tyndale's Bible, and which is technically illegal. You can actually be hanged for this. And Henry says, maybe we should revisit this question. So he does, but what it is he sees it as a way to emphasize his power. So thus you get the authorized version, which is basically Tyndale, and there's a frontispiece on the cover. You can look this up, Henry VIII Bible frontispiece, and you see this larger-than-life Henry in this woodcut. Tiny little Jesus at the top, giving, so what he's doing is giving grace to Henry, but Henry, larger than life, is giving the word, giving the Bible to the people. Mm. And on one side are low church Protestants who are being hanged, and on the other side are Catholics who refuse to go along that are in jail.
Right.
So this is the godly way. So that's what the sign is. This is the godly way. These guys on the side here are getting God's punishments. But if you receive the Bible from me, you're going to be given grace and salvation. Yeah. So that's essentially the Henrician schism, the sermons twice, 3 times a year against papal supremacy. So by the time you get to Queen Mary, there's one of these interesting discussions. Should some of the people that were burned have been burned for heresy? Heretics they were. Should they have been burned for it? Because were they even the right matter ecclesiastically and canonically to be tried for heresy? It's actually a really interesting question that Monsignor Philip Hughes provokes, because these guys were all raised with these yearly, quarterly sermons against the pretended supremacy of the Pope. And what exactly was Catholicity when Mary came to the throne? Most people kind of identified it with the Mass, but it was more. So bringing in papal supremacy, after all you heard your whole life is the Pope is the Antichrist, that his supremacy is pretended, that the king is really the head of it, that's all you've ever known. How can you actually be a heretic? And it's really good argument canonically in Hughes. So, in general, Queen Mary's rule and the burning of heretics is horribly misrepresented. At least a third or more. Cranmer would have burned under Edward VI, and Elizabeth would have burned. Sometimes she did. In those eastern counties that held very heavily Unitarian, you have what's his name, Philippot, who was an Anglican. He was put to death under Queen Mary, but he wrote a tract on why the New Arians, that is Unitarians, and others, and the Anabaptists should be burned as heretics. And what the language he uses there is basically any Catholic inquisitor would use exactly the same language, right? So they viewed it exactly the same way. There was nothing unique or new or strange about what Queen Mary was doing. It was rather normal. There was just a feeling, though, of a bit of injustice, like it was too much. Like maybe a lot of these guys weren't the right guys for it. But the fact of it, it was normal. Everybody burned heretics in those days. It was just what you did. Protestants did it likewise, or what have you. So it wasn't a revolutionary or crazy thing to do. It was that a lot of people had sympathy. It's like, well, wait a minute. Here's these new bishops, Gardner and Tunstall and all these figures that were diehard Henry supporters that preached against papal supremacy. And now here they are putting men to death for not admitting papal supremacy. And it really what it was is a failure in the politics of the crown to see the weakness of that position, because what it is Queen Mary. You have Wyatt's rebellion when the Spanish marriage was announced between Mary and Philip II. And that provoked a response, and not just from Protestants, but from Catholics too. So now Protestantism was the locus for it. Wyatt and others, they were hardcore, Protestants, and so the crown looks at Protestantism, which is also from abroad. You got Marian exiles, right? They're being funded from abroad. They're bringing propaganda in. They're actually bringing people in to take up, take over the crown. So Mary looks at Protestantism as revolutionary, and therefore she uses the church to deal with something that's more political than it is religious. And that's probably the main error in it, all around. And so then Elizabeth will learn this lesson. So Elizabeth will simply take, Catholicism in itself is treason in and of itself. It means you're a bad Englishman to be Catholic because you serve a foreign power, the Pope. And that's how it's all couched, so that we're not persecuting religion, we're persecuting treason. Mm-hmm. Just everyone that's treasonous happens to also be Catholic. But anyway.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, and she says attending a mass is a Latin mass of Rome is treason because you're attending the rite of a foreign monarch, the Pope. So that's no good for her. Right. I want to close up with a question. It's interesting that John Fisher was named after John the Baptist, not John the Evangelist. So, and he was decapitated by a king. John the Baptist was decapitated by a king. John the Baptist, his crime was speaking against an invalid marriage. St. John Fisher, his crime was speaking against an invalid marriage and the presumption of power by a king. But we didn't talk about today, or you didn't reference today, the other bishops. How many bishops were there at this time in England? And Fisher alone defends the Catholic Church, the Catholic faith, the Catholic Pope, and he loses his head for it. What about the other bishops? Were they just sort of thinking, well, this is a hard time, I still kind of like the Pope, let's just wait this out for 10 years and see how maybe Henry will die? Were they closet papists? Were they happy to go along with Henry? Were they just cowards? How do we understand that 90-something% of the bishops, the Conference of Bishops, if you want to call them that, of England, completely apostatized?
Right. There were, if I'm not mistaken, about 23, 24 bishops in England, not counting auxiliaries and some absentee ones. And Fisher was one of them from the smallest and poorest diocese in Rochester. And there's a debate historically amongst historians whether Fisher himself, because there's a tradition that he refused to be divorced from his own see, to take to divorce a poor wife for a richer matron somewhere. There's a debate whether he actually said that or whether this was invented later, and really he was just blocked from taking any advancement because of Wolsey, right? So who knows? He's the only one. So you got his very good friend Cuthbert Tunstall, who ended up, he was a longer holdout actually than Convocation was, because he was the bishop in York, in Durham, and when later York. And when Henry came, he said, "No, I can't give you that title, Canada, King of the Church, or King, that you're the head of the Church of England. I can't give you that." And eventually Henry convinced Tunstall that this was a good thing. Other bishops, Stephen Gardiner, for example, was part of he was part of a group in Cambridge called Little Germany, which included Cranmer, Robert Barnes, a few people like that were agitators in one way or the other in cycling Lutheran or Tyndale's propaganda into England. A lot of it would actually be Tyndale translating Luther out of German into a very good, I might say, very fluent English, a lot of witty slogans, and he would send these pamphlets along, and they'd be disseminated. So Gardiner was the chief guy for arguing Henry's case in Rome. And in reward for this, he was made the Bishop of Winchester. You had other bishops who were just weak. The Bishop of Ely, the Bishop of Lincoln, they knew Fisher, they're friendly with him, but they were just weak. And they looked at it, their incomes, and they said, it is some of them. Maybe this will all pass over. King and Pope, they go to loggerheads. This won't really be a lasting thing. Others, like Gardiner, were committed to the new regime, right? And of course, Cranmer, duh. But with Gardiner is interesting. So you see, he's one of the bishops that go to Fisher in the Tower and say, "Come on, you're making this look bad. Can't you swear the royal supremacy?" And in Fisher, of course, he offers his life and his blood for these men. So what happens is, under Edward VI, You have the abolition of the Mass and its replacement with the 1553 Book of Common Prayer. For Gardner, this is a wake-up call. Because for Gardner, it's one thing, of course, to deny papal supremacy and other things. But wait a minute, we can't deny the Mass. That's ridiculous. That it's clearly proven. He spent many years defending the Mass from Low Church Protestants as part of the Henry's propaganda and whatnot. So now I can't go along with this. So he and Tunstall and several others, they're put in jail by Edward VI, and then they get released during the reign when Jane Grey's very very short time as queen, not properly crowned. And they go immediately to Queen Mary, give her allegiance to her, and that's why they become the point men for the regime. Even though, it's interesting, Gardner was just as much responsible for for her mother, for the annulment and her mother being locked up, as Cranmer was. But she doesn't go, even though she kept Gardner at arm's length to a certain extent, she didn't go after him with the fury that she did against Cranmer.
Yeah.
Right? So an interesting little tidbit there. But so a lot of these guys suffered under under Edward. And then when it came time to restore Catholicism, they went to it 100%. So much so that the clergy that they worked on producing with Cardinal Pole, once he'd come in back from the continent as the papal legate, they affect a clergy that is so strong and so devoted that when Elizabeth comes to the throne, all but one remain true to the Catholic faith and suffer exile or hide and say Mass or move to Scotland.
But that's the second generation.
And it's the inverse. That's the second generation.
Yeah.
Whereas at John Fisher's time, every bishop except him apostatized and went to Henry. Under Mary to Elizabeth, it's the inverse.
Right.
Everybody stays true to the Catholic faith except one guy.
Right.
It's just testament to that.
Oh, Ryan Grant, I hope
I
hope that we have a regime change in that everything flip flops. So here in America, there's one bishop that I can think of who's saying good stuff all the time. Y'all know who he is on Twitter. And man, wouldn't it be great if it was flip flopped and they were all saying good stuff and just had one bad bishop? Lord Jesus, have mercy on us.
It will probably take a persecution.
Yeah,
and that's right.
Well, because that second generation of bishops knew
historically.
Go ahead. We had a delay.
They did. Oh yeah, sorry. Historically, there are saintly bishops, and you got your Augustines, you got your Ambrose, your Peter Chrysologus, your John Chrysostom. You've got others, your Saint Norbert, Saint Francois de Sales, Saint Robert Bellarmine, Saint Charles Borromeo. Right? They're almost the exceptions that prove the rule.
Yes.
In terms of saintly bishops and holy bishops. Then there's a lot of bishops who are good and worthy men. In those times, that just need the right push. And then there's some that go from mediocre to bad and evil. And historically, the rule tends to be that the mediocre from bad to evil form a clerical culture that, which even drags in some of the worthy men who just don't know where to go, otherwise worthy men, and kind of forms this clerical culture of going along to get along with the powers that shouldn't be in the world, whether that's royal authority or the Democratic Party. I mean the government.
Yeah, sitting around, drinking appletini in their leather print sofa, doing nothing. That's where we're at today. So, yeah, there's a lot of parallels. Of course, we didn't even touch on, we mentioned it, but we didn't talk about the change in the liturgy. There's so many parallels from England. It's like a microcosm of what seems to be unraveling right now in our own time period. So, yeah, it is possible for all but one bishops to apostatize. It is possible for the state to completely take over an ecclesiastical jurisdiction. It is possible. It is possible. And I kind of wonder, with everything we've seen with this corona crisis, we've seen the state, we've seen judges, we've seen governors say, you can't have a public mass in the United States of America. America. People saying you cannot have public mass. That sets a precedent, folks. Don't want you to be scared, but I want you to be aware. All right, so let's wrap this up. Ryan Grant, any closing thoughts or remarks, especially as it applies to our own time?
Yes. So people historically, especially in these times, in Henry's time, it seems most people weren't even really aware of what had happened until about the Pilgrimage of Grace, until the monasteries were suppressed. Later times, when you get to Elizabeth, people are aware. They're ready for it because they've been trained with the reform under Queen Mary. So a lot of people had to go without the sacraments out of an account of genuine persecution. You keep the faith in secret, keep the faith in private, and it's hard to do, but we have the examples of people who did it. Or again, I mean, you can look at Japan too, where 300 years they keep the faith, or 200 years, something like that. And father to son passing it down. The next generation had no clue what Catholicism even looks like. It's just right. You're supposed to ask priests these questions, and then if they don't answer them right, they're not a priest. Interestingly, if a priest today had found them, would they have accepted it? And probably not. So that's why we have to keep the faith that we have received. It doesn't mean deny, the legitimate developments of the tradition and whatnot, but we have to keep the faith as, like the whole thing of Loren. What has always and never been believed in eodem sensu, in the same sense.
Yes.
Right. So that's the same faith as the early fathers, as the medievals, as the Baroque period, the same faith even now. And we have to maintain it. And we have to be willing to suffer. A lot of people are not willing to suffer. They'll pay lip service to it, but they really are not ready to. And it's a hard thing. I mean, that's what Lent is supposed to be about. It's why you're supposed to take on fasting and other things. But, in this case, no, it's not good what we've had to deal with. It's not right, but you have to be ready to suffer. And if this is just a foretaste of what's coming down the road, of like a Elizabethan-style persecutions, or worse even from our own, church, well, we got to be ready to keep the faith. And we will to Christ. It can't just be Christ's fair weather friend. Okay, it was great, and I had these great masses and great music, so I was there for you, Lord. But as soon as it got hard, well, I just couldn't take it. Yeah. Don't be that guy.
Yeah. Be the Fisher. Be the Thomas More. Be the Maccabee. Yeah. Be the John the Baptist. Now's the time. Good. Ryan Grant, thanks, man. You gave us a lot of information. That was drive-through history reloaded. Lots of info there. So thanks. Thank you so much. You guys can follow Ryan Grant on Twitter, Chester Bellick 3. Is that right?
I think so.
I think that's right. And all the links to his books, including a link for you to get the book that he mentioned of the publishing. What was the title again, Ryan?
St. John Fisher. I always get the subtitle mixed up, even though I made it. Reformer, Humanist, Martyr. There's another one that I sell, Defense of the Catholic Priesthood, which was translated by a priest in the early 20th century, Hallett. And so it's a great little tract against Luther. It's the only one of his writings to be translated to English, of his theology writings. Okay. So that, although I am working on it, I have a project to translate another one of Fisher's works. I've got someone else doing it because I'm too busy. So I think that's on the website too. I'll have to get the link up for that.
Good. Well, thanks for making all this stuff available. It's priceless. So everybody follow those links, check them out, get that book. It's a good time to read about a good holy bishop, to get encouraged. And then we'll close up here. Please, we'll pray our Hail Mary and our Glory Be, but please like the video, hit the thumbs up, please subscribe, hit notifications on your tablet or phone, turn YouTube notifications on. You'll get notified of these live streams. If you want to listen to the audio versions, just go into Stitcher, iTunes, Spotify, your favorite podcast app, and search my name, Taylor Marshall, to come up. You can listen to it. And you can save some of your streaming data, because streaming is hard right now. People don't know this, but our internet across the country is lagging because all the kids, all the students are streaming their classes every day. people are streaming their meetings at work every day because of the corona thing. And so the internet's dragging right now. I was kind of worried about it this morning, hoping that we'd be okay. You're a little fuzzy, but you're in Idaho, right, Ryan?
Right.
Yeah.
And I'm on satellite internet, which is dodgy. And just because of the quarantine, I'm actually not supposed to be in my office because I'm not considered an essential business. So
Right.
I had to move the whole operation home.
Yep, which makes sense. So thanks so much for everybody's support on Patreon. We are sending those books out, and we're going to get you signed up in New St. Thomas Institute. If you're at student level above, you'll be getting all the history of the Roman Rite and the Latin Mass lessons. We're getting all that set up. And the books that are being signed and shipped out are a little behind because the guy who ships our books is only open sometimes half days. And so we're just a little bit behind. Thank you for your patience. Hopefully you'll get them within the week. But things are a little bit slow in that regard. So if you're wondering where are my signed books, they're just a little bit behind. So everybody, thanks for watching. We'll close up. Ryan, can you pray a Ave Maria and a Glory Be with the pipe?
Yes.
All right, let's do it. Oremos.
Yes, there's a Jesuit once who was asked, are you allowed to smoke while praying? And he says, well, of course not.
Yes.
But you are allowed to pray while smoking.
There you go. That's it. That's the old joke, Jesuit joke, I think. Okay, here we go. And then next time you got to tell me what's up, and I'll get a pipe, and we'll pipe it up together. Oremus.
Sounds good.
In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Ave Maria, gratia plena Dominus tecum. Benedicta tu in mulieribus et benedictus fructus ventris tui, Iesus.
Sancta Maria, Mater Dei, ora pro nobis peccatoribus, nunc et in hora mortis nostrae. Amen.
Gloria Patri et Filio et Spiritui Sancto.
Sicut erat in principio, et nunc et semper, et in saecula saeculorum. Amen.
Amen. Saint John Fisher, pray for us. Saint Thomas More, pray for us. All sainted bishops, pray for us. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Thanks everybody for watching, and remember, pray the rosary every single day. If you don't pray the rosary, you're not on the team. This week, start praying those sorrowful mysteries. Get ready for Good Friday, and then we'll have Easter on Sunday when Christ is risen. Till this Friday, I might live stream tomorrow, Thursday, do some Holy Week stuff, and then probably Friday, maybe live stream a rosary and do a Q&A. So look for those. Make sure you're subscribed so you get notified. Again, Ryan Grant, thanks for being on. Thanks for smoking with us and teaching us about John Fisher and Henry VIII and all that. It was a great ride. Appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
All right, everybody, Godspeed. Till the next one, pray for us. We'll pray for you.